We're today beginning a new series, which we're calling Media Apocalypse. And it's going to talk about what ails the media and journalism and news gathering and the goal of an informed public. And our first guest today is Victor Pickard, who has a new book out called Democracy Without Journalism. And Victor, you're from the Annenberg Center at Penn, but you're on leave this year, right, in London, is that right?
That's right. I'm sitting in London this very moment.
That's great. Well, anyway, I'm very interested in hear about the book and about your ideas for reforming media. And I guess I want to start by asking you the following question. You are deeply critical of the media system we have that is largely market-based and that relies on profit-making companies to inform the public and to do investigative journalism and basically produce the right kind of media ecology. And so your view in this book is that we really need to shift more to a public model, or a model in which the government plays either a regulatory role, antitrust, for example, or a role of provision, that is subsidization, using tax and subsidies to basically fund and create endowments or other kinds of ways of paying for journalism and for information. So I wanted to know whether or not you could briefly explain what that public option would involve.
Yes, gladly. And that's where I end up in the conclusion of my book, arguing that in many ways, our last best hope for the kind of journalism that we need in the United States is a public option. And we can think of this in many different ways. One is simply to reimagine what our public broadcasting system might look like, to imagine an expanded and repurposed public broadcasting system to become more multimedia, digital, and better funded. And so I argue that we ideally would be taking money directly from the U.S. Treasury to expand this already existing public infrastructure. But I also offer other plan Bs and Cs for how we might fund that system and how that might look like. But the end of the day is that I argue that it should be publicly owned and controlled and democratic at all levels of governance and media production. That should be the vision. And then we can talk about how we get there.
Now, we do have some experience with public radio and public television. But I'm particularly interested in how you imagine things would work for newspapers, magazines, and their online equivalents.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I guess the first step would be to push us to rethink about these boundaries between print media, broadcast media. Increasingly, those are no longer meaningful distinctions. That said, I do think that we have to look at the existing newspapers as they are today and think of ways where we can salvage the actual journalism that's still being conducted within those institutions. But ultimately, I imagine that we need a national network. So as we build out and expand the public, what was the public broadcasting system, we'd have two options of either sort of subsuming those newspapers within the public broadcasting network, or to see more of a collaborative role. Already you're seeing that where public radio stations are complementing various news outlets in different cities across the states. So I don't think we have to figure that out, but the main point though is that this distinction between print news and public media, I'd like to sort of blur those distinctions ideally.
So would the idea be that, for example, in Cleveland, where the newspaper is on its last legs, the idea is they would sort of merge with the local public broadcasting stations, and they would become the news gathering arm of those stations, and then they would have an online presence on the web, and they'd have a video presence and a radio presence. Is that the sort of idea you have in mind?
Yeah, that very well could be one possible route. I mean, just to give a more concrete example, I used to be a radio show producer at WILL 580 AM in Urbana, Illinois. and they've already rebranded themselves as not a public broadcasting station, but a public media station. So I think this is already happening. Now, the legacy newspapers clearly have their own identity, their own history. So I don't see this happening tomorrow. But if we assume, or at least I would argue, that we need to have this national network. And so where the newspapers fit into that network, that can be determined case by case.
And one more thing I wanted to ask you about the funding. So as you know, the history of public broadcasting in the United States has been highly complicated and fraught. It turned out differently than in Great Britain, in which Congress originally gave certain amounts of money. You got political pushback. Attempts were made continually to drain or to squeeze money away from public broadcasting. And finally, you move to a system which is a kind of combination of government grants and other kinds of funding coming from private corporations, charitable corporations, and then viewer drives and other ways of basically cobbling together what's necessary to keep public broadcasting going. Do you imagine a different model for funding for public media, what we're now going to call public media?
Yes, absolutely. And you're absolutely right that the way we've set it up structurally in the US is not the ideal. It's not the way that the Carnegie Commission originally imagined for our public media system. In fact, they initially argued for there being an excise tax on television sets, which would have been more similar to a BBC funding model. So there are different ways we can do this, but I do think we need to change the existing model where it's pegged to the appropriations process. It's impoverished. It's been kept economically and politically very weak. But I think this is a fixable problem. It's something that other democratic societies around the world have figured out, and I think we could as well.
Right, and you're not imagining, I take it, taxation of existing media. You're thinking to move things from one to the other. And you're not thinking of, and you're thinking of creating a new model, right, in which the government would basically set aside a certain amount of money, which it would not be able to touch very easily or squeeze for political purposes.
That's absolutely right. Now, whether we build upon the already existing model, so for example, reform the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, that's an open debate that's actually happening right now. People are calling for, if nothing else, a rebranding, renaming it Corporation for Public Media. But I think that's something we can figure out. But at the end of the day, we definitely need to restructure the existing system so that it's not so dependent on government and on this appropriations process. And there, you said about taxing other media, that actually is one option. I mean, we could be taxing commercial broadcasters or even telephone, cellular service providers. We could be taxing the big bad duopoly, Facebook and Google. So there are various potential revenue streams.
I know those selective taxation of media entities would raise First Amendment problems, which perhaps we can talk about later. But there are many, many ways, I assume your point is, to raise money.
Yes.
Scott, could you ask a few questions?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Victor, for coming on this show, and also your book is so clear and such a depressing read.
I'm sorry.
No, I mean it's so of the moment, unfortunately. So can you first state what I think is your diagnosis, and then let me just first of all tell me whether you think I'm right about what the diagnosis is, and then maybe kind of suggest some possible alternatives to public option. So it seems like there are two separate causes for our present malady. One is the fact that the revenue model for media, for journalism, has been advertiser-based and commercially driven. That's one, and the ad money is dried up, and various other associated problems. The second is the fact that there's been either a lack of regulation or a deregulation, which has led to not only lack of regulation, lack of requiring media to have public interest broadcasting, dropping the fairness doctrine and the like, but also media concentration. And it seems like these two causes by themselves are bad, but there's an interaction effect between them, which is that the large media concentration is able to skim off or soak up all the ad dollars so as to starve the ad-dependent smaller competitors. So it's not just ad revenue, the funding model, and media concentration, but it's the combination of the two. It seems like it was the real killer here, that Facebook can take away, skim off the 85% of the ad revenue, and Sinclair can buy up all the small local stations. But so your view seems to be is that we can kill two birds with one stone, or deal with both causes together by having this public option, because it would change the revenue model and it would also deal with the large media concentration problem. But I was wondering whether we could solve the problem by, like, when the Democrats get back into office, because that's when this is presumably going to happen. What they should do is start to unwind the media concentration, get rid of diagonal integration, enforce antitrust laws, reinstitute no more than 40 stations, things like that. That would seem to me to break up the interaction effect between the funding model and the concentration, such that it would wouldn't that by itself relieve a lot of the pressure?
That's an excellent question, and a lot of people are making similar arguments right now, that our first step should be to start trust busting some of the monopolies, whether we're talking about Facebook and Google or the more traditional media outlets. There's certainly concentration in these different sectors, and you're really pointing to that argument that I make in the book, which is we have a degree of what might be called American media exceptionalism in the U.S., where we have the worst of multiple worlds, where we have an overly concentrated media system that's only lightly regulated. It'd be different if we were at the mercy of highly regulated monopolies, but we're not. And then on top of all that, it's an extremely commercialized system with only very weak public alternatives. Now, I would argue that as much as we should try to break up some of those monopolies or create more competition in various ways, I don't think that actually gets at the root of the problem. I do think you need to go back to this commercial logic to get at the root of the problem in two different ways, both in how it creates particular biases that I try to sketch out in the book historically, that this has always been a problem. But more immediately, what's happening in front of us by the day is that the market is driving journalism into the ground. So again, this commercial imperative is counterproductive to having a democratic media system. So even if we were to have more competition, less concentration, I don't think that would solve all of our problems. It wouldn't solve, for example, the news desert problem and things of that nature. But so it's necessary, but insufficient is the final.
So it kind of follow up on the politics of it,
Sure.
Which is that unfortunately public broadcasting is part of the cultural war, and conversely, trust busting has populism going for it, and not only that, but it would have knock-on effects. That is, if you bust up Amazon or Facebook, but you can also bust up other kinds of monopolies too, which is very, it seems to me, has a lot of political appeal. So I was wondering what you thought about the politics of pushing one or the other.
Yeah, I agree exactly. You're absolutely right. It's a rare bipartisan consensus, or at least an emerging consensus at this moment, that the platform monopolies have too much power, and so that's a leverage point. And I'm fine with being strategic, and maybe that, and that's, I've argued this in separate standalone pieces, that we really should be going after Facebook and Google. I call for taxing them, but having them put their tax money into a public media fund, not just back to the commercial publishers who are also complicit in this journalism crisis. But all that said, I don't think we should give up on the long-term vision. And also, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but if polling data are to be believed, actually, there's still a fair amount of trust in public media, even among conservatives. Or maybe it's better to frame it as there's not as much distrust as you might assume among conservatives. And I briefly worked in Congress, and I would see this, every 2 years when they were threatening to kill Big Bird and, save Sesame Street. And many of those Republican lawmakers would end up supporting public broadcasting at the end of the day, because it was still very popular among their constituents. So I wouldn't give up on that front yet, but I agree with you that strategically it might make sense to focus on the antitrust approach.
I want to just follow up on Scott's point. It seems to me there are at least two different ways of, if you want to maintain a public option, there are at least two different ways of dealing with the political problem. And they've been done before, as you know, because you know the history of public broadcasting. One is charitable. That is, it's halfway between public and private. You have the creation of public charities. They're charities that are not controlled by the state, but which are for public purposes. And companies can give money to those. Not just Facebook and Google, but any corporation really could donate to those. You could create incentives for such. Those could be run in the public interest as public charities, and they could help either subsidize other institutions, or else they could run an institution. That's one. The other model is federalism, and this here I want you to say a little bit about how the Corporation for Public Broadcasting developed, which is that the way it now works, as you know, is that in different states there are different entities that take care of broadcasting, as well as the National Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And that was partly done because one of the best ways of making something politically palatable is to tell each state that they're going to get a piece of the pie, that if money is going to be doled out, each state will get a little of it. And that also tends to assuage regional rivalries and ideological differences as well. So can you say a little bit about how federalism played a role in public broadcasting?
Yes, and I'll confess up front that I don't know all the details state by state, but you're absolutely right that it does play out differently in different states, and of course, in some cases, state governments also subsidize public broadcasting. So the calculation comes out now to about we each pay about $1.40 per year for our public broadcasting system. But if you throw in state and local subsidies, it gets up to about $3.40 per person. So I think that's arguably.
What I'm considering is, instead of just having this account of the state's treasury, the federal government gives block grants to states for the purpose of funding local public media. And so from the state standpoint, it's like free money. They love that. They always love free money. But it's going for a particular purpose, which they can then take political credit for. So this is win-win. This is how we do federalism in the United States.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think we can build on that. As a matter of fact, right now, there are bills being put forth by Democratic senators who are arguing for a similar scheme where there are these grants that are allocated to various states with an emphasis on dealing with news deserts and also underserved communities. And this is right now, I guess I shouldn't, hasn't been dropped yet, but anyway, the discussions around these bills are that it would be run through a similar CPB, Corporation for Public Broadcasting structure. So a long way of saying that I think the federalism approach is one that's gaining traction even now as we speak within Congress. But very quickly, I also want to note, I mean, what you said about the other model of sort of a philanthropic or charitable model, that's also happening in two different ways. For example, the Salt Lake Tribune has become a nonprofit entity. The Chicago Reader is trying to do that right now. And I think we're going to be seeing much more of that. The Baltimore Sun is trying to do that. but there's also the B Corp, the Public Benefit Corporation, which the Lenfest papers in Philadelphia are doing. So that's more of a low profit model. So there's so many different structures that we could be advancing right now. So in that sense, even though it is depressing, I'm sorry, my book is depressing. I try to end on an optimistic note, but I do think that the crisis is also an opportunity, and we're already seeing some of these alternative structures gain traction.
RonNell?
Yeah, thanks. I think for what it's worth, Victor, those of us who are in this group share that that both dread and optimism, right? And so it's great to have you here with us thinking in both of those veins. I have a sort of foundational question about the sort of core of your economic theory. And then I have a question that I think bleeds into some First Amendment and statutory legal questions that I'm hoping to ask. The first of the questions is just a really foundational one, which is, do you think that the commercial model ever aligned with society's democratic needs? I mean, there's a widely held assumption within journalism, but also I think notably within law, that somehow we did luck out in like at least the 1960s and 1970s in the so-called glory days of Watergate and Cronkite and two newspaper towns, where we did have something like ad-supported news that was also at least sometimes really advancing the public interest. And I ask this because I think that this question of whether profit motives on the one hand and journalism's public serving mission on the other hand are always in tension is a really important one. It might matter to whether the public option is the only possible structural fix ultimately, or whether other even entrepreneurial solutions that have sort of as yet undiscovered, right, are even worthy of our brainstorming efforts. And I think that your book at some point seems to be suggesting that public funding is the one and only way that we could actually bring about the sort of core needs of democracy. But at other points, I feel like, as sort of Scott mentioned, you're suggesting that something short of that might suffice. And so I'm just wondering whether your core theory is that they are at base always in tension, or whether something less than that might suffice.
Excellent question. And I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that there is no room for commercial outlets and, that I want to like end them tomorrow. But to go to the core root of your question, yes, I do think they've always been in tension. I think historically, it's quite clear that they have been. That doesn't, and again, it doesn't mean that commercial outlets shouldn't exist. But many of these problems have been present arguably since the dawn of commercialization of the press. And we're seeing many of these tensions, of course, blow up today. So I guess what I would argue is that we need to have a public media system, like that's absolutely necessary. But I think there's an argument to be made. I would lean towards this argument that a mixed system is ideal. So where you would have a mixture of, you'd have public options, you'd have commercial options. It's just right now the balance is so out of whack in the United States. I think in other democratic countries where you see a much stronger public media system, that's a healthier media ecosystem. So I don't know if that really addresses your question, because I'm trying to hedge a little bit by saying, of course, I mean, point to the New York Times or the Washington Post, they're commercial entities. I think there have always been these positive externalities going back to the golden era of journalism, which is often held up. I don't really subscribe to the nostalgia argument, but I think you can look at the conditions from that period. They were very profitable. They had enough money to put towards journalism, and things have certainly gotten worse since then. But I don't think we should argue that that's what we want to go back to. We want to go to something different.
Yeah, so this bleeds, I think, really well into the sort of legal definition question that I think overlays onto this. If we opted for something, or not opted, if we either opted or had no choice but to accept something less than a full public funding model, what you sometimes refer to as the taming or eroding of our capitalist tendencies rather than a full replacement of it. And thus we continued with some version that had these private commercial news organizations continuing to exist. It feels to me like all of the models that you discuss seem to really require something that we do something that all of us who are here on this show have talked about a lot in the past as being really, really tricky within the law, and seems to be really tricky within this space that you're discussing, which is line drawing on the basis of sort of who counts as the press, right? So if we do a tax credit for citizens to use to pay to subscribe to the news media, like the Canadian model that you describe, or the French high schooler proposal, everybody who's in high school gets some amount of money to use to give to the press of their choosing, or if we do an AmeriCorps style team of subsidized reporters at press organizations, or tax credits for press organizations, or the 50c3 status for press organizations like my hometown paper, the Salt Lake Tribune, is doing. All of those seem at base to demand that we specify who the press is, like who qualifies for these things, and who's doing that sort of core press function. And I'm just wondering if you can chime in on this, because this is a big fat debate that we are having for purposes of the press clause of the Constitution, and for purposes of how to craft statutory treatment of the press, is sort of who is the press today in the current media landscape. What functions do you think would count and make you the press? Would Fox News qualify, and would MSNBC, or, you know, going further than that, would Breitbart or InfoWars or OAN or their equivalents on the left? Even, and it seems to me like even if we move to a full public funding model, you suggest that there should be some heavy governance by or a role for a team of independent members of sort of journalism professionals. But would that itself require us to know who the press is in order to populate these advisory boards? I'm just wondering how we get, how we tackle that definitional question of who counts as this in order to move forward with some of these plans.
Yes, that's such an excellent and daunting question that I won't pretend I have all the answers for, and especially on some of the legal questions, I'll defer to all of you to sort that out. But this debate is so central now, not just in the abstract, but if you look at what's happening in Canada right now, they are in the thick of it, trying to figure out who they should be subsidizing, since the government has agreed to subsidize local journalism, and it's caused a lot of controversy because much of that has disproportionately gone to the legacy, you know, the incumbent publishers, and it has cut out a lot of the independents and the smaller nonprofit outlets. So I think that it's an inherently thorny process and a messy debate, but it's an absolutely essential one. And every democratic country is going to have to be grappling with this going forward. And I think there are things that we could do quite right off the bat. We could say it should only go to nonprofit outlets, non-commercial outlets. And you know, in terms of figuring out who's a journalist, we need to have independent advisory boards figuring, you know, debating. I mean, there are different mechanisms we can use, but it's not as impossible as many people might assume. And certainly there will be First Amendment implications and huge fights over this. But I think it's doable. But more than that, I just think it's unavoidable going forward. We're going to have to be subsidizing journalism at some level. And going back to the earlier question of, you know, this market failure is not going away. So it's only going to get worse, actually. So we are going to have this debate, and it's going to be really ugly, but we have to have it. I'm sorry. You're muted.
Sorry, you got it?
Yes,
yeah.
I could, yeah.
Can you just tell me who you envision populating those advisory boards? Who specifically would be doing that?
Yeah, okay. Ideally, I mean, everything. So I'm imagining this, if I were to have this public media system, you would have different levels. There's a federal body, maybe this version of the CPB. There should be state level bureaus, local bureaus. They should be representative. Ideally, in some cases, they might even be voted on. You know, as we need to make the process as democratic as possible. But I don't think there's one formula. But it needs. We need to make sure it's not just a handful of people at the CPB making these huge decisions. It's going to have to be as democratic as possible. And just to add to that, I mean, to give some examples, obviously journalists should be on there. Labor representatives from the News Guild, local representative, that sort of diversity of makeup for those boards is what I'm imagining.
Sandy?
I too spent some time in public television and lived through a number of the funding wars. And I read your book as taking us very clearly towards a public option without stop. And I'm interested in a number of things like how the tax incentives are supposed to bring commercial operations into the system. But more to the point, I want to know what you propose would provide an independent funding option. That is, public funding that isn't going to ultimately require the public broadcasters who are part of this system to continue to operate always with an eye toward the political process. Now, that may not be all bad listening to your definition of the advisory boards, but watching the BBC, for example, right now deal with the conservative government. Anyway, it was one of the key questions I had after I read your book on a practical level.
Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent. And that your question especially resonates with me because I'm constantly hearing from my British friends about all the problems that the BBC has, although I kind of wish they were our problems in the US. But I absolutely agree with you. There are many public broadcasting systems we can point to around the world that have been captured by governments, and this is something we have to be vigilant against. I think again, structurally, we can set it up so it's unlikely for that outcome to occur, but it's never going to be possible to completely do away with those political pressures. You're absolutely right. I do, however, think that even if you look at the track record of the CPB, it has created somewhat of a firewall between. I mean, if you think about during the Bush, George W. Bush administration under Kenneth Tomlinson, they really tried to capture the CPB, and they had very limited success in doing that. Yet, all that said, I think we should build in stronger firewalls. And the public broadcasters are a very important part of this this coalition to try to reimagine journalism. I think again we have these old divides between journalists and public broadcasters, and there's no reason why that divide should exist. I think we all could be working towards a public media model. So I don't know if that gets to your question, but the one last thing I'll say, going back to the critique of the BBC model. It stands to be further democratized. I think an ongoing critique of the BBC model is that it's very elite driven and it's not publicly owned. It's more public in name only. And I think we should be working towards actual public ownership.
You realize, of course, that was the arguments being made in the early days, not so early. I mean, about public broadcasting and remains so. I think that's one of the most critical issues that has never been adequately resolved. Jack, did you want to move on, or do you want me to?
RonNell had something else she wanted to add to follow you up.
Fair enough.
Just to follow up to this question that Sandy asked, Victor, at a couple of places in the book, it seems like you sort of dismissed the suggestion that public funding models inevitably lead to a press that is, for lack of a better term, like a mouthpiece for the state. And you note some pretty persuasive studies suggesting that publicly funded press elsewhere are actually less timid and sort of more accountability demanding than the commercial press might be. But I feel like we need to name the name and ask the question, which is there reason to believe that Trumpism poses a unique threat in this regard? Because he has sent some pretty significant signals about his desire to make press entities mouthpieces in various ways and disappointment in press entities that don't act as mouthpieces. And I just wonder whether, as a really pragmatic political matter, there's some reason to believe that the environment that we have here in the United States in a Trump or immediately even post-Trump era changes that calculus.
Yes, excellent. Another excellent question. Yes and no. I mean, I think obviously the Trump administration poses all kinds of special concerns along these lines, but I don't think that means, I don't think that stands as an argument for not creating a public media system. And of course, this is something that is going to take for a very long time. We don't know how long the Trump era is going to last, but ideally this could not even be actualized until post-Trump, a post-Trump era. But I think that it's still possible to create something that is independent from the government, that the government does not have control over. And other democratic countries have done this. So I think those concerns are valid, but it shouldn't be a reason for paralysis. You know, I think we need to go forward with this. And to go back to an earlier argument, I do still think that there should be commercial outlets as well. I just think some of these problems that we're talking about will never be served by a commercial system. Like, for example, the news deserts problem. There's no market solution for that. So we're going to have to look for these public options.
Scott?
I actually, the Trumpism concern.
Well, then let me just throw a couple of more ideas for you to think about, Victor, along these lines. If you're worried about the national government's interference through the executive branch, then you might want to focus on funding sources that don't require permission by the executive branch of the government. Those would be either the charitable model you described earlier, which really requires the market actors, that is corporations, to contribute, or a federalism model, which is basically the states getting lots of money and then planning their own systems. In other words, you're not always going to have a president who is going to be interested in the kinds of issues you're interested in. So you want to create a system where there are these other participants who could, in fact, have a hand in and be able to continue to make things work even when the president is hostile.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I agree. And having this this federal model, I mean, it doesn't have to be, the money can be guaranteed by the federal government, but it can be determined and allocated through the states. And we saw this with the New Jersey state government doing.
Well, I was thinking in particular about the problem of news deserts. It seems to me that it would probably not be a good idea for the federal government to basically solve the problem of news deserts itself. It might want to identify parts of the country where the problem is most serious and distribute money out to those places. In the same way, although I don't want to make too much of the comparison, in which it distributes money unequally in the case of disaster relief.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which this is kind of like disaster relief.
An acknowledgement that this is a disaster for democracy, at least.
Yes, I think that's an apt analogy. And it's absolutely, I mean, to the extent that I put some flesh on these bones in my book, I'm certainly imagining the federal government should be involved in guaranteeing that the adequate resources are being put aside for this. But I agree that it should be through the state. I imagine everything being devolved, and not just state governments, but then to local communities should be determining how that money's spent and what those newsrooms should look like. So yeah, a long way of saying that I absolutely agree with you. But the even the charitable models are unlikely to address the news desert problem. So that's why I still see this necessary role for a public system that's dedicated to universal service. I mean, that universal service mandate is something you only find in a public media system.
By the way,
wait a minute, Jack.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm just going to ask you, as well as Victor, why you believe that at the state and local level, one, you will get anything less than a political or unfair and perhaps even corrupt-based operation, and doesn't that immediately lead to a need for then a national body which oversees the states and deals with those political issues? Or put differently, haven't we seen the block grant problem once before in other areas of American social life? I'm just interested why you and Victor, let me turn to Victor really, and ask whether you really think that's the best model and how you would oversee it to achieve the goals you're so clearly interested in achieving.
That's a great question, and I might want Jack to answer that. But
Always, Victor, always throw the tough questions to me.
yes, but I will say that you're right. I mean, even looking at the early history of public broadcasting, that exact problem arose with especially public broadcasting stations in the South that were overtly racist, and the central central institutions try to exert authority over that, so that tension is going to be there. But I also think we have to be ready. I mean, conservative communities will likely have conservative newsrooms, and we have to be okay with that. I'm not assuming that there's going to be a progressive outcome always from this model.
Thank you very much, Victor. We really appreciate having you aboard the first episode of what we hope will be a continuing series.
Such a treat to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for engaging with my book and for inviting me on this great program, this great show. I think Scott referred to it as. It's a real privilege. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yes. Bye-bye.